Greetings and welcome to Lobes and Robes, How Neuroscience Can Change the World. This podcast is sponsored by the American University Center for Neuroscience and Behavior and explores the links between neuroscience and key policy questions today. I'm Susan Carl, a professor of law at American University Washington College of Law, and I will help lead discussions throughout our series along with Dr. Terry Davidson, Director of the Center for Neuroscience and Behavior at American University and a distinguished professor of neuroscience here. This podcast is for anyone interested in how scientific discovery can make the world a better place. Thanks for listening.
It's our pleasure today to welcome Dr. Laurie Bayet from American University in Washington, D.C. as our guest on the podcast Lobes and Robes. Dr. Bayet got her undergraduate degree at Pierre and Marie Curie University and also received a PhD in psychology from the University of Grenoble. Dr. Bayet is a developmental cognitive neuroscientist interested in infant cognitive development and high-level vision. Her lab combines EEG, behavioral methods, and computational tools to uncover how infants and young children learn to interpret complex visual objects relevant to affective social communication. To that end, the lab has a particular focus on the rich, clinically relevant, and well-described case of affective facial perception and understanding. Dr. Bayet's work has been recognized with a Rising Star Award from the Association for Psychological Sciences and a Distinguished Early Career Contribution Award from the International Congress of Infant Studies. I am also pleased to say that Laurie is my esteemed colleague in the Department of Neuroscience at American University. Laurie, welcome to the Lobes and Robes podcast.
Hi, I'm very happy to be here today. Thanks a lot, Terry, for your kind introduction.
So, Laurie, could you tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to have the research interests that you have?
Yeah, sure. So essentially in high school, I was interested in the relationship between mind and brain. And so as Terry said, right, I did an undergrad degree in Paris. And so I studied biology, I studied cognitive science at École Normale Supérieure. And when I did this, I kind of developed my interest in vision and cognition. But then as a second-year master's student, I took a course on genetics and cognitive development. And so I had some background in biology, so it seemed like a good fit. But in taking that course and kind of thinking a little bit more about what I wanted to pursue for a PhD, this is kind of when I started to realize that I wanted to study development. I felt kind of drawn to developmental approaches, specifically kind of this notion, which is a little naive, but this notion that to understand the brain and mind, you need to understand how they're built in early life, right? I also thought, and this was completely wrong, of course, that if you went early in life, things like mind and brain, nature, nurture, wouldn't be so entangled yet, and it would be easier to kind of tease them apart. And of course, this is, not quite right. It's completely wrong. But still, I was drawn to developmental approaches, and so I started a PhD with Olivier Pascalis and Edouard Gentaz at the University of Grenoble, in France, and so there I focused on how infants perceive facial expressions. I traveled to the US for a postdoc, so I worked with Richard Aslin and Charles Nelson. I had a joint appointment at University of Rochester, Boston Children's Hospital, and Harvard Med School. And so there I researched how infants represent visual objects, as well as contributed to a longitudinal project, a large project, looking at early neural responses to facial expressions in early life in connection with risk for psychopathology. So in doing that, I kind of got further training in neuroimaging methods with infants.
That's awesome. So all of your work studies infants?
Not all, but I would say the majority has focused on infancy, yeah. Broadly speaking, right? So 0 to 3.
So interesting. So I have looked at your papers. I can't say I understood all of the papers, but it does seem like one of the things that you're identifying is how the infant brain goes through different stages of development. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what those findings, both your research and other scholars or other researchers, what is understood now about how the infant brain is sort of developing over the course of months?
So I would say that, in current understanding, we wouldn't necessarily talk about stages necessarily in terms of qualitatively different steps that the infant brain will go through one by one, right? Rather, I would say, and this isn't something that I actually study, because I study cognitive development, right? Not brain development per se, but they're essentially multiple processes are unfolding with specific timing. And that includes things like myelinating fibers, right? So information going faster. Things like maturation of circuitry, right? So creating connections, creating the wiring of the brain and then pruning that out based on experiences, right? So things like sensitive periods, critical periods, so meaning that periods in development, right, where the brain is maximally, optimally, particularly responsive to certain kinds of experiences. And in some cases, if it's not getting that experience, then it's kind of in that holding pattern. So in any case, a moment in life where experiences are particularly important, so the wiring of the brain, right? So we have myelination, the wiring of the brain, and yeah, I think that's, I'm not sure if that was what you were asking about, or honestly.
Yeah. So this is a problem with being a layperson, so my language was not precise. I guess, could you tell us a little bit about what is known about how infant cognition, and especially cognition related to vision, is developing over infancy?
Yeah, so essentially, I think one of the things that we've learned, right, from this this field, and again, this spans many decades, and even in some cases almost a century, more than a century now, I think, is that infants do perceive the visual world from birth, right? However, we also know that in terms of acuity is relatively poor at birth. So young infants see more poorly, essentially. That said, they do perceive things that are out there in the visual world. They tend to orient towards faces. There's some suggestion, right, that they're already starting to learn about the things that they see around them, particularly things like, say, the face of their caregiver, right? And we also know that they start to kind of interpret what they see, right? So it's not just about kind of pattern recognition, they're also starting to think about what they see, right? So, for example, things like if an object is moving behind another object, you're going to see it as two parts, right? But as an adult, you're going to be sure that this is the same object, right? So can infants tell the same thing? It turns out that, at least from a couple of months old, they can. And they're also making inferences about things like objects. If this is an object, right, do I expect this object to say, go through another object, or will they be all kind of collide, right? So expecting objects to be solid, things like this. So we know that essentially infants not only kind of perceive the visual world and learn from it, but also already starting to think about what they see and look at things at least in ways that suggest that they have expectations about how things are going to work, right? How the world is going to behave.
Let me ask one more question, and this is for our lay audience. How do you tell what infants see and know?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So, and it's actually a fairly contentious one. So essentially, in terms of the history of this, it's actually pretty interesting, I think. Maybe I'm just a little nerdy on this, but if you go back in history, so it turns out that for a fairly long amount of time, right, people have wondered what infants see, right, what infants think. And so if you go back to earlier writings, right, so things like biographies of babies, right, so looking at what a single baby does every day for the couple of months, trying to keep track of when they start doing certain things, people have tried to figure out, for example, do babies see different colors, right? That was a big question that people had. And so then they had to kind of figure out ways to look at this, right? So things like, well, maybe if you put little pieces of paper that are in color on a gray background and they can pick at the pieces, then that would suggest that they can see the pieces that are colored, right? All right, but then what if the baby is young enough that they can't reach yet, right? So then, so on and so forth, people have started to figure out that babies could look at things way earlier than they could, reach for them in a way that suggests purposeful movement. And so then people have kind of used looking times, looking behavior to make inferences about things like learning, cognition, vision, and so on, right? So for example, let's say if it's the child is, say, 3 months old, 4 months old, right? And you show them faces that are the right way up or upside down, on average at the group level, right? You'll find that typically infants at this age tend to look longer towards the face that's the right way up, suggesting that they, first of all, they can tell the difference, right, visually. And second, perhaps they've already started, and you can kind of confirm this by looking more precisely at where they're looking on the face, right, that they've already started to learn how to look at this type of objects in a way that is efficient to get the information they need, right? So, for example, focusing more on the eyes and mouth and nose and so on.
So, Laurie, can I ask a question? So maybe we're going to go back a little bit here, but I have a granddaughter, Liana, who is he just turned 1 today, matter of fact. And I'm wondering how it is you can work with infants that even younger than that. Do they pose particular kinds of challenges? I know that, you can tell an older kid to pay attention, or an older kid that can follow instructions. How do you manage working with infants that are so young?
Yeah, so essentially this is where, tasks that engage looking behavior are great because you don't need any formal instructions. So babies will tend to look longer towards certain things spontaneously, and that includes not just what I was saying, right? So things like, faces right or up, but also things that are novel, things that are surprising, right? It's surprising not in the affective sense, right? In the cognitive sense, right? So things that violate expectation is the technical term. So, and again, the idea is that then we can use this type of behavioral method to tease out cognitive expectation. And then, of course, there's also neural measures, right? Neuroimaging measures, where you don't necessarily need instructions, right? You can look at how the brain responds to seeing certain things, to hearing certain things, to seeing certain scenarios, right? Using things like, what if something is changing versus something is staying the same? Do you see differences in brain activation there? And so on. So things that are kind of happening even without a direct, explicit instruction, right? So essentially, that's kind of how you can get around the fact that you can't quite ask, a baby to do a particular thing.
I think that's such a fascinating methodology. So the longer the baby looks, then you infer that infant is sort of especially finds that more significant than something the infant doesn't look at for very long.
Yeah, I mean, there are some subtleties to this, right? And there's actually a paper just came out suggesting that maybe in very, very young babies, right, perhaps looking behavior, even that, right, would still not be the best way to get at cognition because they may not have yet enough control coming from cortex than, in very, very young babies, right? Versus that if we're talking 6 months old, 1-year-old, that's not really a concern. But either way, so essentially the idea is that we can kind of piece out, right? So behavioral methods, things like looking times, and with all the babies, things like, grasping, choosing a toy, right? Choosing the cup with the most crackers, right? Things like that with neural methods, neuroimaging methods.
Fascinating. And so you're studying a whole range of infants of the same age and then averaging their responses and looking to see if they're statistically significantly different from responses to other things.
Yeah, so that's the classic way to do it. That's kind of the way I'd say, the bulk of the work is done. I think now, in recent years, there's been a little bit of a comeback, I would say, of wanting to track kind of individual trajectories, right? So going a little beyond averaging over the group, but trying to understand a little bit more about what generates that variability between people, between babies that we do see, and understand more what generates it, what can we learn from that, whether that's in terms of kind of predicting trajectories or understanding mechanisms of change. But on the whole, most research still, is doing, I would say, group averaging.
So, Laurie, when I first studied or learned about facial expressions, it was all adults, and they had these pictures of people who were making expressions associated with various emotions like fear and happiness and so on. And people are easily able to identify those things. I'm wondering, there was some thought, I think, that whether these kinds of recognitions were learned or innate, and when exactly do they start to show up, where it seems like an infant might be able to recognize specific emotions. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, and so maybe just maybe a little bit of a caveat first. Just a quick note. I'm going to try to not make this too lengthy, but so I think when we say facial expression of emotion, it's a useful shorthand, but I think can be important to remember that it's also a little bit of an oversimplification, because we know that, so there are multiple problems with this, right? So for example, if we say, facial expression of emotion, there's some issue with using emotion here and using expression, right? So we know that there are some association between, say, some patterns of facial movements, right, facial configurations, and experiencing certain affective state, emotional state, but that connection is actually a little bit nuanced and debated, right? So we say it's, fear faces, angry faces, but if you think about it, right, the last time you've actually felt angry or are scared, right? Were you actually making that face, right? Or vice versa, right? So empirically, we know that there is some evidence for this type of association, but it's just a little bit more nuanced, right? Both in terms of the spectrum, right, of potential emotional states that one may have, right, versus the relatively more limited number of kind of patterns of facial movements, right, that people tend to have that are associated with those affective states, and in terms of kind of the robustness of those associations, right? So essentially, in practice, if you think about how you're actually looking for expressions in other people, right, we are looking for those expressions, but typically you're using them in context, right? You're interpreting them. There's some element of uncertainty, of ambiguity, right? So it's not just a pattern recognition problem where you're just kind of put on your facial expression recognition lenses, right? And then you just read out people's state of mind from their face, right? So instead, you're looking at those cues and you're integrating those cues, you're thinking about them in context, and there is an element of uncertainty. And maybe you're doing this also specific to a particular person, specific to a particular knowledge that you have about their goals, their desires, what their beliefs, their current scenarios, right? Second, we say expressions, but sometimes they're really cues, right? So for example, let's say you're disgusted by something, you're not scrunching your nose because you want to express disgust, right? You're scrunching your nose as kind of this pattern of facial movement that perhaps has some other purpose, right? So is a paper suggesting that maybe it's actually blocking your nose, right? So preventing you from inhaling something not so good, right? So it's more of a cue in this case, right? Perhaps. Or let's say you're a little mad at someone, and so you're making this frown, but not necessarily because you want to express, hey, I'm angry, but you actually, maybe want to look a little more scary, right? Look a little bit more like you want to compel them to do something, right? So essentially, there are lots of situations like this where it may not technically be an expression in the sense that you're seeking to communicate, to express your internal state, right? So all of this kind of comes together when we say, facial expression of emotion or angry face or fear face, right? So it's a little bit of a misnomer. And it would be more accurate to say something like patterns of facial movements associated with affective states. And so and then no one knows what we're talking about. So I'll just go ahead and talk about facial emotion, emotional facial expression, angry face, and so on. But just with the caveat that, to remember that those are really simplifications, and in practice, things are a lot more nuanced. And it's important because it affects how we set up designs and and the type of question that we ask, right? For example, if we think about, it's a fear face and that's it, that's all there is, then we can ask questions like, well, when do babies tell those apart, right? But then that obscures another important question, right? Which is, okay, but in practice, you're doing a lot more than just reading out a pattern, right? You're interpreting cues. And so then you can see how that would shift the question from when do infants tell apart, say, a fear face from an angry face configuration, to what type of inferences are they making, right, based on those patterns of facial movements or those other kind of forms of affective expression. All right, so with that caveat in mind.
Can I follow up with that just a little bit? And that is, and I know this is probably a little bit out of your domain, but I'm going to ask because I just like to hear your opinion on it. And that is, we've had in the news recently a number of folks who may have committed crimes, and it turned out, they were, how should I say, despairing over the loss of somebody that they turned out to have done away with. And I'm wondering that if brain activity, so I call that a simulated emotion. And again, I know that maybe not something that you know about, but can you detect kind of, are there ways that look at brain activity where you might be able to detect when someone is feigning an emotion rather than showing a genuine response?
Not to my knowledge, no.
No. Okay, so it couldn't be used because obviously we have things like lie detectors, which look at autonomic nervous system responses and sympathetic responses. And so I was wondering if brain activity would be another way of getting at that. Apparently not. Okay.
I mean, you can, beyond going at things like, arousal, right, which is essentially, I think my understanding is that's what, quote unquote, lie detector do. The answer is basically no to my knowledge.
So back to the question about how infants recognize facial expression. What does the research show about how that process of being able to do that happens? Does it vary culturally? Is it something that's learned? Is it something that's innate? Is it something that genetics has a role in?
Right. So, as with a lot of things, we see both genetic and kind of contextual factors shaping up this skill. And so it's not really either or. So we know there's some genetic component in terms of, say, heritability estimates, right? So, for example, studies estimate typically in the order of 30%, give or take, of differences between people in how accurate they are at recognizing just kind of standardized patterns of facial movements compared, so that could be attributed to genetic differences between people in adults within a cultural context. But then we also know that experience and culture matter a lot. And obviously this is something that is learned, right? We're not kind of born with a knowledge that, say, a frown means a particular thing, but we learn to kind of infer affects from those facial movement cues. I think there might be some discussion around what's going on with the canonical fear face, or the gasping face. But for most intents and purposes, it's just kind of learned, and we know that experience and culture shapes, at the very least, how we interpret those configurations, right? So even for the gasping face, for example, we know that there's some cultural variations. For example, some cultures where it would actually be used as a threatening display. And even within a culture, we know from the work of many people, but I cite just one study by Seth Pollack, finding that children with experiences of physical abuse tend to have a lower threshold for categorizing a face configuration as being angry. And you can see how that could be adaptive to do that within that context. So essentially, there's a lot of data out there kind of documenting variation in terms of how people attribute emotion, infer emotion from facial configuration between cultures and then even within culture based on this type of experiences. We know learning matters a great deal, essentially. And so I think at some point you were asking about how infants come to that knowledge, right? So how do infants learn those things? And so I think a lot of the existing research that we have, including my own, has looked more at, I would say, the pattern recognition part of this problem, right? So how do infants perceptually differentiate between, some discrete patterns of facial expressions, usually static, right? So things like a gasping face versus a frowning face, right? So fear versus angry, something like that. So we know a lot about that. And essentially what we know is that a very, very young infant, right? So say newborns, 3 months old, we know tend to look longer at faces that are smiling compared to faces that are not, although it's not always, and it's a little bit unclear necessarily why, right? So, is it just that perceptually it's more salient? There are some questions around that. We also know that infants at that age, they may, at least they seem able to detect big changes in, dynamic facial movements, right? So if you start making a face or make a different face, it looks like they pick up on the fact that it looks different. By 3 to 4 months old, there are a handful of studies suggesting that there might already be some increased perceptual processing of those kind of gasping fear faces, static. Now, by 7 months or so is when we have a lot more data, and that's where we see a lot more kind of direct evidence, accumulated evidence that at this point infants can perceptually tell the difference between a number of static facial expression configuration, right? So say like smiling, anger, fear, and so on, right? So they can tell those things apart. And in particular, it's also by then, right, if we look at those kind of older studies where we know that babies start to be able to put all smiling faces from different people in the same category, right? They're able to do this with other emotions later, but smiling looks like is emerging a little bit earlier there. And it's also at that age, that 7 months, such that infants tend to allocate more attention to those kind of static fear faces, right? So gasping mouth with wide eyes. So things like if you show them this face and then show them something distracting on the side, they'll typically take a longer time to look away from the fear face than, say, some other kind of face. So essentially here by then we have kind of a lot of accumulated evidence that infants start to be sensitive to the perceptual differences between expressions. Their brain processes them, maybe a little differently, or at least they can tell the difference. And then there is this tendency to allocate attention to specific types of facial configuration.
Is there evidence that studying an infant when he or she's very young is predictive of sort of developing issues around, emotional reactivity or other kinds of emotional issues?
So essentially, I think this is a question that a lot of people are very excited about. So there's a lot of ongoing research, and that's, in multiple labs, trying to tease out, to examine if there is a link between kind of early individual differences in terms of how infants look at different facial configuration associated with affect, like say an angry face, or how their brain responds to this type of stimuli, association with both a kind of risk factor, right? So, if you are exposed to a certain risk factor, you're more likely to show differential patterns of responses, or later outcomes, right? So if you show a certain pattern of response early in life, and then if we kind of come back 3 years later, are we going to see different outcomes? And this sort of data are still coming out, so we're going to have more answers in the future. But I think what we see now is that it looks like there are some of those associations that exist. However, sometimes the mechanism isn't necessarily always clear, so there's still a lot of open question, right, before we're able to really use this type of knowledge to, for example, design an intervention or predict outcome for an individual infant, right, or even just stratify individual infants in terms of, say, risk or kind of profile. So here I'm going to give you one example, right, of a study that came out, and this is from the laboratory of Charles Nelson, and a paper was led by Emily Rayleigh. So I found an association between kind of caregiver stress, right, how stressed the caregiver was, and accelerated patterns of increased attention to angry faces, right, something that tends to show up a little later in toddlerhood, late infancy, right? But here was showing up a little earlier for those infants with caregivers who are stressed out. So here we have an example of an association, right, between a risk factor here, a differential patterns of response, right, to facial emotion, here angry faces. But there's still a lot of open questions, right? So for example, why is it, right, that we see an association like this, right? So is it because those babies get exposed to such faces earlier than others, right? So we would need some data on what they're seeing to answer that. Are they more likely to interpret those faces as threatening, right? So is it in terms of the cognitive interpretation? So we need some data on that to be able to answer that question. It might be that this response profile is actually adaptive, right, for babies with this type of experience, and that it's actually associated with healthier outcomes for babies with a caregiver who is experiencing stress, right? So differences can be adaptive, right? So here we would need to have data both on kind of the risk factor, but also on outcomes as a function of that risk factor, right? So essentially this idea that maybe some of those patterns of responses might be kind of moderating association, right? Or so essentially here we have modifying trajectories, right? So it's not a simple, A to B link here. And even then, even if we had that complete pattern, then we also need to figure out, okay, what's the best way to intervene, right? In this trajectory, if we wanted to intervene, what's the best time to do that? So here again, we need kind of a bit more data on mechanisms and time window. So essentially, I think this is a great question, and there's lots of ongoing research that is being done in multiple places to try to tease this question out from multiple angles. And I think what we're seeing is that there are a number of associations or a number of ways in which risk factors are associated with differential responses in infancy to those facial expressions of emotion, and also kind of vice versa, right, in terms of associations between those differential patterns of attention or responses to facial emotion and later outcomes, either kind of directly or in terms of moderating some other association, right, between a risk factor and an outcome. That said, it's not to say that, you have an individual baby and you're able to say, okay, well, we're going to do this test and then we're going to be able to, know what to do to have a better outcome, or, predict whether or not this child is going to have a higher probability of experiencing typical social affective development, or, things like that, right? We're not quite there yet.
I think there's an interesting link between what you're talking about here and somebody we just interviewed who is working on what she calls the neuroscience of dignity or human rights, and the right to freedom from fear, and how this work that you're doing here sort of relates to that, and the need for infants to be in a certain context and situation where they're not experiencing fear or stress from their caregivers and that kind of thing. So it does seem like there's a lot of policy implications, maybe not directly or definitively at this point, but this research does seem to be headed in directions that would have policy outcomes.
So I'd like to explore that a little bit more, and just for just observing my own grandchildren, and there are a lot of times where, and I think parents these days are very concerned about early life experiences, and will those early life experiences have some dramatic effect on later childhood or adulthood? And there are plenty of cases where infants are going to be stressed, like perhaps during potty training or other kinds of issues where they could be stressed. How much, do you have any thoughts anyway, about how seriously that kind of things that might stress an infant, how long or are they likely to have, if they have a difficulty potty training, for example, or if they have a, difficulty sleeping and they're crying out at night, those kinds of things, are they things that parents should be worried about?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So essentially, and so here I'm stepping a little outside of my direct expertise, right? But people who study the impact of stress on development typically, like to emphasize the distinction between, something we might call healthy stress, right? Adaptive stress and toxic stress. So what does that mean? So essentially, we have a stress response, right? So our body kind of is able to mount this response that allows us to respond to situations that are a little challenging. That on its own is not problematic, right? And so, in fact, experiencing some degree of challenges can be a good way, right, for a child to kind of learn to navigate this. But the distinction here is in terms of the intensity, the duration, and the amount of support that they are getting, for example, from a trusted caregiver, right? So this is kind of what's called, buffering, right? So is there buffering of that stress response by the presence of a supportive caregiver, right? So for example, a parent. And so that really kind of draws the line between an amount of stress that can be even helpful, right, to development, and then an amount of stress that can go into that kind of toxic stress zone, right? So stress that is too intense, going on for too long, without the support of without the support of a caregiver. And so this is kind of the latter, right, that people are worried about when we talk about the negative impacts of stress on development. Right? So it doesn't mean that, infants should never have to experience anything stressing or stressful or challenging.
Absolutely not. Yes, and it's just fascinating the discoveries about the importance of the social conditions of that the caregiver is experiencing, in an ongoing basis. It seems to be something that's becoming more understood. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that there is definitely an increased recognition that as a society, right? So as researchers, as we try to understand, to tease out the impact of early experiences on development, then, the logical consequence is that we need to worry not only about the child in isolation, right? But also within, their context of development. And that includes what's going on for caregivers and in caregivers' lives, right? So if, say, caregiver stress is associated with infant development in all of those ways, right, then one implication, is that if you support caregivers, right, and that's both prenatally and also during those first few years of life, then that support will indirectly help children reach their full developmental potential, right? And so this is not something that personally I'm studying, but there's a lot of ongoing research going on by people like Kim Noble and Natalie Brito, studying the impact of policies that kind of aim to support caregivers in multiple ways on infants' development. And here that can take many forms, right? So maybe you have one form in mind, maybe, but there are lots of potential options, right? So for example, things like access to prenatal care, right? Other forms of prenatal support, paid parental leave, child subsidy, child tax credit. Right? We heard a lot about that recently. Affordable, high-quality daycare and early learning options. Right? All of those things are kind of different forms of support, right? That can, again, help children reach their full developmental potential. And the research is ongoing on kind of what each of those type of support does in terms of infant development. But I think there is, on the whole, an already pretty strong case for supporting children and caregivers in the early years.
Absolutely. So, such important policy.
Laurie, just another question, that is having to do with caregivers. It's often a case where, especially if a person or family has a caregiver from outside the home, that they quit, they change, they have different caregivers that have to come in, and there'll be new things. I'm wondering, does the infant pay that much relative attention to the face, or is it the expression on the face the thing that young infants will pay attention to more? I'm just asking basically what kind of stress levels might be, I guess stress would be involved with changing caregivers in an infant's life.
All right, so here it sounds to me like you're referring to this notion, right, that there's this kind of stranger anxiety, right?
Well, I wasn't, but you got I think what you're talking about is probably a good description, yeah.
All right, so here, I think it will depend on the age of the infant, right? And so here again, this isn't something that I study directly, but people who study things like attachment, right, have shown for many years now, right, that over the course of the first year of life, there's a development of the attachment system, right? So infants begin to form specific bonds to their caregiver, so that if caregiver goes away, then they may feel stressed in a certain way, right? And so then they can form attachment with other people as well, right? Maybe a secondary caregiver, a third caregiver, and so on. But then this it's put in place over the course of the first year of life. So maybe, if they're older than 6 months, then maybe they're going to understand what's going on when a caregiver goes away better than when they were younger. At the same time, around the age of, about 9 months, and again, this is not, a sharp onset, right? It's kind of something that is developing. Infants also begin to be better at telling people apart, right? And so then those things combine, right? Would explain why by a certain age, right, during that first year of life, infants may start to react more when, say, even if their caregiver is present, but someone they don't know yet come in, right? Maybe that person looks in a way that's a little unfamiliar to them, right? Maybe they've never seen someone with glasses or with a beard, and right, and so they may react to that, or in a situation where maybe they're going to daycare for the first time and need to adjust to that.
Laurie, do you want to talk about the paper that you wrote about how young children come to learn to distinguish between animated figures and not, real ones? Is that worth going into? Or
yeah, so this was work with Ben Ballas and Alison Saville at North Dakota State University. So this was with work with school-age children, right? So they're already quite. They're not learning about distinguishing dolls from adults, from real people, right? They already know how to do this, but we were wondering kind of how did their brains process this type of faces differently, right? So specifically, we were using EEG, right, to ask if school-age children and adults kind of perceptually process real faces versus artificial faces differently. So real faces were just pictures of real female-presenting people, and then for artificial faces, it's pictures of kind of doll faces, right, also female-presenting. So why did we ask this question, right? So and this is because we were interested in how animacy is processed in the brain, and doll faces, robot faces, avatars, all those things are kind of interesting edge cases in the sense that they are faces, but they're also not fully animate in the usual sense, right? So they're kind of an edge case for the comparison between animate and inanimate things. And to look at how children and adults perceptually process those faces, we focused on relatively fast brain responses coming from occipital and temporal parts of the brain when we look at visual images or objects, right? So technical terms, P100, we look at the N170. And so what we found is that in both children, so those 5 to 10-year-olds and adults, we did see a difference in the average brain responses to the real faces compared to the doll faces, coming about 170 milliseconds after the image comes up on the screen. So suggesting that essentially their brains were processing those types of images differently. So that was kind of, not necessarily very surprising. We can obviously tell them apart. But what was interesting is kind of when that differences came about, right? So that 170 millisecond telling us that it was something not related to super, very low level differences, but something a little bit more complex going on in those images. And it turned out that if we turn the images upside down, I still saw that same difference, suggesting that perhaps what was driving the differential brain responses had to do with the texture of the stimuli. And so there's more work that has come out around that time and since telling us that perhaps texture is one of the cues that helps the brain perceive animacy. And so here, those results kind of align with that, and showing here that that may be the case also in children and in adults looking at this type of doll versus real faces. We're also interested in whether or not, if we look not just at kind of average responses in occipital or temporal areas, but kind of patterns of responses distributed across the entire brain over the first half second of processing, right, not just 170 millisecond. Then if those patterns of brain responses are distinct enough that we could ask a machine to guess if it's the person looking at a doll or a real face. So is there information there about face animacy, and if so, how robustly? The answer was yes for adults. For children, we didn't find evidence of this. Maybe we would have that with more data. So, it was kind of still a little bit of an open question, but that's what we found.
Fascinating. Well, I see we're sort of running out of time, so maybe let's wrap up. Let me ask you, what other issues do you see as needing to be studied on a priority basis?
I think it's exciting time for developmental research. And when it comes to research on things like facial expression perception, kind of affective cognition, I'm kind of excited to see progress on 3 fronts, I would say. So one, I would be excited to see new tasks that kind of push the field to go beyond static pattern recognition, right, of this few standard gasping face, running face in samples that are often homogeneous, middle class, and so on, right, to look more at how infants cognitively understand expressions of affect. So what type of kind of inferences are they making? What type of reasoning are they engaging in when they are seeing this type of cues? 2, also things like, naturalistic facial movements, right, as opposed to just kind of static stimuli, more representative samples, maybe studies that engage in cross-cultural work, right, looking at those cultural differences that we know start to kick in very early on, right. There are studies found cultural differences in how infants look at facial expressions at 7 months old. So it starts pretty early. So that's one thing, right, so to get a new task, to ask new questions that I'm excited about. I also think that as the field kind of progresses, right, then we might be in a good position to kind of move away from, or maybe beyond, right, the more simple group averaging, right, to look at more kind of dense design, to look at mechanisms of change along and kind of individual trajectories. Or conversely, looking at average responses at the group level, but in data sets that are large and diverse enough that we can kind of examine association between brain and behavior, between brain and experience, and learn from that.
That's a very big research agenda, but all sounds so important.
And again, I'm saying this not just for my lab. I think it's an exciting time for the field at large, and I'm excited to see a lot of progress being made in all of those directions, not just in my lab, but also elsewhere.
Thanks so much, Laurie, for joining us today. I really appreciate you participating. It's very interesting to learn more about your field and more about how infants' brains work. So again, thanks again.
Thank you, Laurie.
Thanks for having me.
Really all so fascinating and important. We appreciate your coming on.
Well, that's it for this podcast episode. Thanks very much for listening. And as always, we welcome your feedback at neuroscience.policy@american.edu. We hope you'll join us again for our next episode. And do let us know if there's anything in particular you'd like to hear more about.